Tony walked down the long hallway that abruptly ended, with a door appearing in front of him. A bright flash of light caused him to squint, and he heard a loud noise in his ears. Then, a booming voice told him, "You're going to start over. Don't waste your time." Tony felt a forceful push and suddenly returned to his body, feeling disoriented by the experience in a familiar but strange place. Tony struggled to regain consciousness and opened his eyes, but he felt he couldn't control his muscles to do that. As his senses slowly returned to him, he began to recognize familiar sounds, and finally he heard the voice of his beloved wife, Jessie. Her voice was like music to his ears, and he felt a wave of emotions wash over him as he realized he was back in the world of the living. Despite feeling weak and disoriented, Tony's heart was filled with joy and relief. All he wanted at that moment was to hold his wife in his arms and tell her how much he loved her. He longed to assure her that he was back alive and right by her side once again. He couldn't move his limbs or say something. As Tony slowly opened his eyes, he was met with an unfamiliar room. He could see medical equipment surrounding the bed with tubes connected to his body. The room was silent except for the beeping of the machines. He couldn't see anyone in the room, and he felt a sense of emptiness. Tony's mind began to fill with questions. How did he end up in a hospital bed? How long had he been there? What had happened to him? He couldn't recall anything about his past or his present circumstances as he lay there. Tony felt a sense of confusion and disorientation. He wanted to call out to his wife to let her know he was awake and needed her, but he was too weak to do so. Instead, he lay there listening to her voice, taking comfort in the fact that she was nearby. She was speaking loudly, and he could hear her words clearly, although he was unsure about the distance between him and his wife. It felt like she was not too far away from him. "Do I have to be on the deed to inherit the property?" Tony heard his wife and was confused by her words, wondering what she meant. "I think he's done. I'm telling you, I spoke to the doctor not long ago." His wife was speaking to someone on the phone. Tony began to hear strange noises in his head again. They were familiar yet foreign, like a distant memory that he couldn't quite place. He felt a sense of unease as the noises grew louder and more persistent, filling his mind with a jumbled mix of sounds and sensations. But then he heard his wife's voice again. Tony's heart sank as he listened. It became clear to him that she was discussing his properties, and it seemed like she was trying to find a way to take ownership of them without waiting for them to be passed down through inheritance. He felt a surge of anger and betrayal, and a lump formed in his throat. Tony struggled to swallow as he tried to process what he had just heard. His throat felt dry and scratchy, and he had to take a few deep breaths to steady himself. He felt a deep sense of hurt and disappointment that his wife would be so calculating and selfish. Despite the pain he felt, Tony knew he needed to stay calm and clear-headed. He couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves, knowing that he would need to confront his wife about what he had heard. Tony's throat was dry and parched, and he desperately longed for a sip of water, but he felt weak and helpless, unable to move or speak on his own. He lay there, staring up at the ceiling, feeling trapped and alone. He tried to call out for help, but his voice was barely a whisper. Tony realized that he would need to rely on the help of others to get through this difficult time. He waited patiently for a nurse or doctor to come to his aid, hoping that someone would notice his distress and offer him some relief. Tony felt a wave of shock and disbelief wash over him as he continued to hear his wife's words. It was clear to him that she was talking to someone else, and the reference to his return made it all the more apparent that she was referring to him. Tony lay there in silence, contemplating his next move. He knew that he couldn't trust his wife or anyone else who might be involved in the scheme to take over his property. He had to be cautious and strategic if he was going to reclaim what was rightfully his. Tony decided that he would not reveal to anyone that he had regained consciousness. He would wait and watch, gathering information and trying to uncover the truth. Jess's voice abruptly halted the noises emanating from the hallway. She appeared to be putting on a show, feigning tears and pleading with a doctor for information. "Doctor," she implored, "please tell me how much longer he will have to endure the suffering." A young voice of the doctor responded with words of encouragement, urging Jessie to remain hopeful and trust in the best possible outcome. "Please pray for your husband. We've done everything we could. You can go home for now. We will notify you of any changes in your husband's condition." Yeah, please keep me informed, Jessie requested, before striding away, the clacking of her high heels echoing through the hallway. As the doctor entered the room, she immediately began interacting with the medical equipment, pushing various buttons and checking the readouts. In a quiet murmur, she muttered to herself, she can't wait for him to be buried alive. What if the poor guy survives? She wondered, despite everyone's expectations. Tony attempted to speak, but found that his tongue seemed to cling to the roof of his mouth, making it difficult to form words. Instead, a strange, incomprehensible sound emerged from his lips, and he made a feeble attempt to open his eyes. When the doctor noticed it, her face immediately broke into a smile. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The doctor quickly walked away. The doctor returned to Tony's room accompanied by several colleagues. They proceeded to conduct a thorough examination, taking blood samples and connecting various pieces of equipment to monitor his vital signs. As they worked, the group engaged in prolonged discussion, sharing their observations and insights about Tony's condition. Eventually, everyone except for a young nurse left the room, leaving her to attend to Tony's immediate needs. The nurse gently placed a damp cotton swab on Tony's lips, and he eagerly opened his mouth, desperate for a sip of water. With great effort, he began to suck on the swab, hoping to absorb as much moisture as possible. I'm sorry, but you can't have water just yet. The young nurse spoke softly as she noticed Tony's eagerness for the swab. That's why I'm moistening your lips with a swab. Just hang in there a little longer, sir. You're a strong man, she added, offering words of encouragement and support to Tony. Tony managed to let out a faint plea. Call the doctor, call the doctor. He repeated it urgently. The nurse quickly hurried out of the room and returned with the doctor. Each word that Tony spoke seemed to cause him great pain, and it was evident that he was struggling to get his message across. Please, he implored, don't tell my wife anything. She must not know, the doctor and the nurse quickly reassured Tony, understanding his request. Don't worry, Mr. Hawkins, the doctor replied. We won't tell her anything with great pleasure actually. We understand what you're trying to say, and we won't say anything to her. They both urged Tony to focus on resting and taking care of himself, assuring him that he was in good hands and that they would do everything possible to support him during this difficult time. The doctor and the nurse left the room, and Tony could hear their muffled conversation in the hallway. He strained to listen as the doctor spoke to the nurse, her words carrying a mix of sadness and frustration. I wouldn't allow her near him, the doctor expressed with a hint of concern in her voice. She constantly asked me about his chances. That's just not right. Her voice trailed off, and Tony could sense the depth of her emotions. Tony was deeply touched by her words. She knew that he was fortunate to have such dedicated and compassionate medical professionals caring for him. After a few moments, the nurse returned to Tony's room with a dropper in her hand. We're going to continue feeding you through your vein, she explained gently, as she prepared to administer the medication. Tony nodded weakly, grateful for the nurse's reassuring presence. Jess's words continued to echo in Tony's mind, causing him to feel a deep sense of hurt and betrayal. How could she? He thought to himself, how could I have missed that she was cheating on me behind my back? Tony couldn't believe that the person he had trusted and loved for so many years could have been deceiving him all along. After all, he reflected, I've been giving my all for the family. I've been doing everything I could to make her happy. He thought about all the sacrifices he had made over the years, putting his own needs and desires aside in order to support her. And yet, despite his efforts, it seemed that Jessie had been unfaithful and deceitful. Tony felt a surge of anger and disbelief as he thought about his wife's careless behavior. Despite all that he had done for her over the years, she seemed more concerned with his money than with his well-being. I never limited her in money, he thought bitterly. I let her live the life she wanted to live, and now that I've been in an accident, she's not even sad. She's just thinking about how to take advantage of me. Tony wanted to scream to confront her and to tell her how wrong she was. He longed to remind her that he was still alive and that she wouldn't get anything after the divorce. After a few days of receiving treatment, Tony began to feel much better when the doctor came in to check on him. He couldn't help but express his gratitude. Thank you, he said. I'm doing better with your prayers. The doctor, whose name was Gloria, smiled and blushed slightly at the compliment. She had been working tirelessly and spent long hours sitting with Tony and chatting with him about everything from his health to his personal life. Over time, The two had developed a friendly rapport, and Gloria was happy to see Tony on demand. "That's awesome to hear," she said, smiling warmly. "We're all rooting for you, man. Hey, listen, I am not allowed to keep it a secret from your wife. You're being moved to another room tomorrow and then—" The doctor couldn't finish when Tony interrupted. "I know what you mean. Well, I guess I'm going to have to face her. I'm not really ready for a fight though. But I heard what she said," Tony said, and couldn't continue because he felt a lump in his throat thinking about it. "Yeah, I heard it too. I just can't wrap my head around it. How could she be so cruel to her own husband?" the doctor said. "Well, it doesn't matter anymore. I'm going to divorce her anyway when I get on my feet," Tony said. As Jessie sat in her living room anxiously awaiting news from the hospital, her mind began to race. In her heart, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her, she found herself secretly hoping for the worst possible outcome. With a sense of urgency and worry, Jessie rushed to the hospital and headed straight to the intensive care unit. "I need information about Mr. Hawkins' condition," she pleaded with the nurse, hoping to get some news. "I can't bear to see my husband in pain anymore," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "How much longer will he have to endure this?" Jessie put on a show of mourning and sadness despite feeling little genuine emotion. The nurse reviewed her records as Jessie waited anxiously. After a few moments of silence, the nurse's expression changed, and she looked crestfallen. "I am sorry to have to tell you this, but according to our records, Mr. Tony Hawkins didn't make it," she said softly, her voice heavy with sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Jessie felt a sense of relief, but she tried to keep her emotions under control and not reveal her inner thoughts. She made an attempt to cry a little by covering her face with her palms before hastily leaving the building. Tony stood by the window, observing his wife as she chatted on the phone with a wide grin. He felt a burning anger inside him, and he realized it was time to confront her without wasting a moment. He hurried to find a doctor. "I need to get discharged. I need to go home," Tony said. "Are you out of your mind? Mr. Hawkins, you were transferred from the ICU this morning, and you want to get going already." The doctor was confused. "I understand, but it's urgent. I can't stay here. I got to finish something really important. I promise I'll be back as soon as I get it resolved. I have to get going. I'm going to run away from here if you try to stop me. So please let me go." Tony was breathing heavily. He was seething with anger as he sat in the taxi, urging the driver to hurry up. As soon as he arrived home, he noticed an unfamiliar man walking around the house with nothing but his boxers. Tony cautiously approached the window and eavesdropped. On the conversation, the man was boasting to someone on the phone. "We're going to remove the fireplace and install a top-of-the-line sound system in its place. It's going to be amazing." Tony silently turned a doorknob and slipped into the house. He stealthily made his way through the hallway and cautiously entered the living room. "Excuse me, may I come in?" Tony asked as he stepped into the living room, addressing the man in his boxers. Jessie's complexion turned ashen in a matter of seconds. She was struck with disbelief and stared at Tony as if he were a ghost. At that moment, she wished it were actually a ghost she was seeing. "Tony? You? How is this possible?" she stuttered, barely able to comprehend the situation. "Shut up," Tony spat through gritted teeth, cutting her off. Tony gave a cold laugh. "Save your fake tears for someone who cares. I know you wanted me dead, but unfortunately for you, I'm very much alive. Now get your things and leave. You are not welcome here anymore, and I see you found a quick replacement," Tony said with a smirk. "Get the hell out. And by the way, you're getting nothing after divorce, I promise." Tony was furious. Tony felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The thought of spending the rest of his life with Jessie, the woman he had once loved so deeply, now made him feel sick to his stomach. He couldn't believe that he had trusted her so completely only to find out that she had moved on to another man so quickly after his supposed death. Tony couldn't help but feel a pang of regret as he thought about all the plans they had made together. The dream of starting a family, raising kids together, and growing old with one another. Tony asked workers to change the locks in the house and not let anyone in while he was away in the hospital. He returned to the hospital as promised. The accident that almost took his life had turned out to be a blessing in disguise. It had opened his eyes to the reality of his marriage and allowed him to make a clean break. Tony spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Gloria often came by, and they talked a lot, which helped Tony get well faster. After Tony was released from the hospital, he had to go through the process of getting a divorce. As anticipated, Jessie wanted her fair share of the business, which she claimed they built together. However, she was unaware that the business was burdened with a substantial loan. When she learned about the loan, she refused to take any of her shares. During the divorce proceedings, she sent her full thanks to Tony, saying that she never thought she would hear from him. But Tony appeared unaffected because Jessie was like an empty void to him now. Sometime later, Tony remembered Gloria from the hospital. After all, he never even thanked her for believing that he would make it. He bought a bouquet of flowers and drove to the hospital. The nurse told Tony that Gloria was operating on someone at the moment. As he waited, Tony couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia wash over him. He remembered the times he spent in the hospital after the accident and how Gloria was always there to comfort him. He realized that he had developed a special bond with her and that he missed her company. Gloria finally emerged from the operating room. Tony's heart skipped a beat as he saw her approaching him. She looked just as beautiful as he remembered. "Tony, what are you doing here?" Gloria was surprised to see him. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you did for me," Tony replied, handing her the bouquet of flowers. Her glorious face lit up with a smile. "You don't have to do that, but thank you. I'm glad to see you're doing well." Tony and Gloria talked for a while. Catching up on each other's lives, Tony asked in timid tone, "Would you like to have dinner together tonight?" "If you're busy, that's okay too," Gloria grinned mischievously and replied. "I'm never too busy for food, especially at a good company." "Dinner it is." Tony felt a connection with Gloria that he had never felt with anyone else before after that night. They started seeing each other more often. They went on dates, watched movies, and even took trips together. Tony realized that he had found something special with Gloria, something that he had been searching for his entire life. Eventually, Tony asked Gloria to marry him. She said yes, and they started planning their wedding. It was a beautiful ceremony filled with friends and family who had watched Tony go through the ups and downs of life. Now, he had found true love and happiness with Gloria as they danced at their reception. Tony looked into Gloria's eyes and knew that he had made the right decision. He had gone through a terrible accident, a painful divorce, and a long recovery, but all of it had led him to this moment with the love of his life. Years later, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Tony thought about everything that had happened to him. He realized that the accident, the divorce, and even the loan had all been blessings in disguise. They had led him to Gloria, to the love that he had always wanted. As he held her glorious hand, Tony smiled and knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, also with the person he was meant to be with.